All right, now I'd like to introduce Ron Holland, our board vice president, who will do the honors for Mary Doria.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Holland, vice president of the Library Board of Trustees. But also, I am a former employee of this library system. I spent 15 years as a younger man in this library system. But most importantly, I'm a former and current customer and user of this library system. Now, we're celebrating the first 100 years. I personally only remember about 42 of those. But former director Steve Wood leaned over to me. He said, "I remember when you were a page." It's always nice to be remembered. That was 1991 when I started here. I was 17 years old when I started as a page here. But I'm also here for another reason, and that is to introduce a good friend of the library, author Mary Doria Russell. Mrs. Russell is one of the most versatile writers in American literature and one of our greatest contemporary storytellers. She's also uniquely qualified to speak at our Centennial celebration. She's well acquainted with the past and has imagined vivid potential futures. Her popular, award-winning, critically acclaimed books run the gamut from historical novels like Doc Epitaph and The Thread of Grace to futuristic science fiction like The Sparrow and Children of God. And we also had the pleasure of claiming Mary Doria Russell as a library customer. For 25 years, the Noble Neighborhood Branch was her local library, and she logged many hours there working on her books. While she no longer is a Heights resident, we also are thrilled to have her back with us. So please welcome Mary Doria Russell.
Hello, my name is Mary. I'm a book junkie. I blame librarians. We addicts all have our stories. Mine is probably not so very different from yours. I was only 6 when I started riding my bike to the Helen M. Plum Memorial Library in Lombard, Illinois. Every Saturday morning all summer long, one of the librarians would read Dr. Seuss books to little kids in the shade of a big old maple tree out in front of the library. The Cat in the Hat, Horton Hears a Who. To think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. Dr. Seuss, the gateway drug of book pushers. In the 1950s, the Helen M. Plum Memorial Library was still housed in the late Mrs. Plum's home. The children's section was in her dining room. I still remember one of the librarians saying to me, "You look like a smart little girl. I bet you'd like Nancy Drew." The tobacco of literature. Just take a little puff. It'll make you look older and more sophisticated. It's a chapter book. Once I was hooked, the book pushers moved me on to literary pot. "I think you're ready to take books out of the adult side," one of them said, and she walked me across the entry hall to Mrs. Plum's living room. "Do you like all those cowboy programs on television? Bonanza, Rawhide, Laramie? You might want to try Zane Grey." And then the Star Trek years. It was time to sell the crack cocaine. Science fiction. Librarians are ruthless. I was 35 before I tried to get clean, and even then, I was vulnerable to thrillers and mysteries. Every time I opened a book, I'd look at the page that said, "Also by." If there was a long list under "Also by," I could feel myself relax. It was like pouring the first drink and knowing that the bottle was full. Then, when I was 40, a librarian suggested that I try Dorothy Dunnet. "She's a Scottish historical novelist," he said. "You'll either quit reading after 5 pages, or you'll worship at her feet." Oh yeah, it was a warning, but it was a temptation too. In the words of the old heroin addict, it's so good, don't even try it once. I plowed through Dorothy Dunnett's stuff. I read the Lyman Cycling record time, jonesing for the next fix. When I was done, I wanted more. She couldn't write fast enough for me. And that was why I started cooking up my own crystal meth. At the age of 42, I sat down, opened a file, and began to write. Today, there are 6 titles on my also by list: The Sparrow and Children of God, A Thread of Grace and Dreamers of the Day, Doc, and Epitaph. But I tried to get clean after A Thread of Grace. That book was about Jewish survival in Nazi-occupied Italy, and it was a monster to write. It was 7 years of research, 2 new languages, and original investigations overseas. During those 7 years, my mother and my father-in-law and my dearest uncle all died of long, terrible illnesses. My son learned to drive and started to date and got his heart broken by his first girlfriend. My own health went to hell too, and I was burned out. And when I finally sent the manuscript to Random House, I decided to quit writing. I called City Hall. I volunteered for the Planning and Zoning Commission. I baked bread. I did needlepoint. I just had to keep my hands busy. See, I had to keep them off the keyboard. I got the shakes. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't sit down. Even my son recognized the signs. He said, "You've got to start a new novel." My own son. I can't, I told him. I'm too tired. I'm menopausal. My cognitive skills are shot. So make it easy on yourself, he said. What about that T.E. Lawrence story you told me about? The 1921 Cairo Peace Conference. Just a couple of weeks in history, not a whole war. No new languages to learn. They all speak English. Yeah, I said. Yeah, straightforward timeline, start to finish. First-person narrative, maybe. And by dinner time, I was right back into a historical novel. Dreamers of the Day is about 11 days in Cairo in 1921, when a handful of English diplomats and oilmen drew lines on maps, invented nations, and planted the seeds of conflict that have blossomed so lethally in our own time. Dreamers of the Day is about the making of the modern Middle East, but it begins and ends here in the Midwest, right here in Cleveland Heights. And it begins just as the first board of library trustees was sitting down together to begin the library system, whose 100th anniversary we are celebrating today. I don't usually read from my books, but I'm going to do that extensively because, to my astonishment, it just maps straight into what we're talking about. You must try to feel the hope and amazement of those years. Anything seemed possible. The end of ignorance, the end of disease, the end of poverty. Physics and chemistry, medicine and engineering were breaking through old boundaries. In the cities, skyscrapers shredded clouds. Trucks and automobiles were crowding out the horse-drawn cabs and drays in the boulevards below. The pavement was clean. No stinking piles of dung. No buzz of flies. America had recently put a professor president in the White House, a man of intelligence and principle, elected to clean up the corruption that had flourished in the muck of politics for so long. Public health and public schools were beating back the darkness in slums and settlements. The poor were lifted up, and the proud brought down as progressives reined in the power of big money. In the homes of the middle class, our lives ticked along like clocks, well-regulated and precise. We had electric lights, electric toasters, electric fans. On Sunday, there were newspaper advertisements for vacuum cleaners, wringer washers, radios, and automobiles. Our bathrooms were clean, modern, and inside. We believed that good nutrition and good moral hygiene would make us healthy, wealthy, and wise. We had every reason to believe that tomorrow would be better than today, and the day after that, better yet. The Great War and the Great Influenza fell on our placid world almost without warning. The narrator of Dreamers of the Day is Agnes Shanklin. She is a 40-year-old spinster schoolteacher who grew up near Cleveland in a time that seemed safe and settled. That era came to an end with a war that seemed far away and incomprehensible, but it was also a war that would touch her own family in 1918, which is when the Cleveland Heights Library Board of Trustees was putting together the funding and the architectural plans for this very building. I last saw my brother Ernest in September of 1918. By the time Ernest left home, 5 million European soldiers had already disappeared into the sausage machine. That's what their commanders called the Great War. To understand why, you must call to mind some modern war. Think of the casualties endured in a year's time, or 5 years, or 10. What is it, 53,000 for Vietnam? Now imagine 60,000 men killed in a single day of combat. Meat fed to the guns. Imagine 4 years like that. America stared, aghast and uncomprehending, while the old world gorged on its young and smashed its civilization to pieces for reasons no one seemed able to explain. Re-elected on a peace platform, President Woodrow Wilson remained steadfast even when he was called coward for refusing to involve us in the madness of foreigners. Then, 8 weeks after Mr. Wilson's second inaugural, a document was captured and made public. In it, the German foreign minister urged the Mexican government to join Germany in a war against the United States, and in so doing, to reclaim its lost lands of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Call me cynical. I always thought that telegram was a fraud, and even if it were genuine, why send our boys to France if the threat was on our southern border? Of course, I was just a school teacher, a woman without a vote of my own or even a husband to persuade. All the men said that document changed everything. Certainly Mr. Wilson believed it did. When he turned the ship of state towards Europe, the nation cheered and felt gratified to have exciting news to talk about. Those of us who saw no need for war found the enthusiasm of our fellow citizens bewildering. I read all the papers, frantic to understand why this was happening to my country and the world. To me, Mr. Wilson's conversion to war was so shocking. It seemed that St. Paul had renounced Christ to become Saul once more. But there you are. Even if the reason for going to the war was a shameless hoax, the war itself was real, and by God, America was in it. Mexico was all but forgotten in the excitement. That's why by the summer of 1918, 1 million American men had been mobilized to fight. My brother's train left Cleveland carrying nearly 250 soldiers, including a boy who seemed to have a dreadful cold. When the troops arrived in Virginia, 2 days later, over 120 of the soldiers had already gotten the flu, and 60 more would fall ill within a day or two. In Ernest's last letter home, he confessed he was afraid he'd miss the war. He was so eager to embark, I doubt that he mentioned his headache to anyone else. The next letter we received was from a friend of his. Ernest had been buried at sea before the boat was halfway to France. Later we learned that most of his battalion had sickened, many had died, while standing on a French dock, awaiting orders in a chilly autumn rain. Now to this day, no one knows for certain where the great influenza first took hold. It was called the Spanish flu in those days. The cases of something very similar had been seen by American doctors even a few years earlier. What spread it was the war. As Agnes recalls, in October of 1918, the military finally canceled leave and liberty, but it was too late to make a difference. Railways distributed the influenza with the same swift efficiency that had carried coal, wheat, and livestock to and from every corner of the continent. Within weeks, the flu was everywhere. People spread the disease before they knew they had it, got sicker, brought it home, and died. It was a lot like Ebola. It was that quick, and it spread that easily. Waves of influenza broke out across the nation, and all the while the war groaned on in Europe. Ohio sent 41,000 boys over. What would you do? Well, I'll tell you what a lot of us did. We boozed and screwed like there was no tomorrow. In the 1920s, we shed encumbrances and avoided entanglements. We were wiseacres and suicides. We were tough cookies and slim customers and swell guys and real dolls. We made our own fun and our own gin, drinking lakes of the stuff, drinking until we could Charleston on the graves. Life is for the living. Poo-poo, skidoo, drink up, the night is young. Does such callousness shock you? I suppose it does. But you see, by the 1920s, the plain, stale fact of mortality had become so commonplace, so tedious. Well, grieving simply went out of style. And yet, look around you. Imagine the courage and the belief in the future that it took the Cleveland Heights Library Board simply to gather in a room together in 1919, to care about a library, to talk about raising money and hiring an architect and acquiring land and books and staffing. Imagine doing that as people died in the streets. In 1926, after the war and after the flu, this building went up. Built during the Roaring '20s, when the stunned, numbed survivors made bathtub gin and danced the Charleston and played the stock market, which brings us to the next decade in this history of the library and Shanklin's story. Having survived her own bout with the flu, Agnes inherits money from several small estates of family members who were not so fortunate. The money provides her with a modest independence and enough ready cash to take a long dreamed-of trip to the Holy Land in Egypt. It is there that she falls in with bad companions, notably Winston Churchill, Gertrude Bell, and T.E. Lawrence, during that fateful week in which they invented the modern Middle East. That is the heart of the novel. But at the end of the story, Agnes tells us what happens after she returns to Cleveland Heights. She sells her rickety old home to a real estate developer who is following the Van Swearington's projects in Shaker Heights, tearing down old houses, putting up ones that are grander, much like flippers and developers in the first decade of this century. As Agnes recalls, the developer left the bank happily planning to bulldoze my childhood home. My lawyer and I went out to lunch afterwards and talked about investments. You ought to think about putting some of that money into stocks, he said, handing me a broker's card. Here's my man. He's got the golden touch. Bernie Madoff, anybody? You might be surprised, she says, to know how many women played the stock market in the 20s. But there were so many of us that stockbrokers reserved special ladies' salons, which were filled from the opening bell to the close every afternoon. There were society ladies who had money to burn, and wives of university professors and prosperous businessmen and minor heiresses like me. With the Great War behind us, we truly believed that the problems of the turbulent past were solved. Yes, there had been terrible sacrifices, tragic losses, appalling destruction, but never again would men of such uncompromising, irresponsible stupidity rise to power. Okay, I wrote it in 2007. So. In the 20s, money just didn't seem as serious as it had been before, and would be again very soon. The stock market was like Old Faithful, regularly spouting fortunes. Playing it was fun. It never seemed to occur to anyone to think, I have enough. It's time to walk away from the table. And then suddenly, it was over. As the Great Depression ground on, even sensible investors like Agnes lost almost everything. By 1933, she survived by selling possessions for pennies on the dollar. And eventually she goes to an old friend who has recently been made principal of a nearby school. We caught up with each other, she said, speaking of colleagues and swapping stories for a while. Finally, though, the moment came when I had to swallow my pride and inform him of my situation. I was over 50 and nearly penniless. Seeing the look on his face, I stopped before I asked about a job, but he knew why I was there. There were no openings for teachers, he said, and I understood, of course. There were men in breadlines, the fathers of whole families, with whole families to support, he added. He didn't have to say the rest. Single women were the last to be considered for any job. I rose to go, and he promised he would keep me in mind, but I supposed he was just being nice. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the morning mail. There was a possibility of a part-time position as a school librarian. The salary was pitiable, but it was the best he could do. Was I interested? Yes. Oh, yes. I was very interested indeed, and it was wonderful to be among young people again. I was officially off at lunchtime, but I enjoyed the work so much that I returned with my elderly dachshund, Rosie, most afternoons. Even in old age, she was a charmer and liked to snuggle with the children who began to hang around the library after school. You know what? I'd say, Rosie just loves stories, but I'm awfully busy. I'd hold out a simple book and look very serious. I hate to ask because I know you're busy too, but I'd take it as a personal favor if you would read her a story while I catch up on some paperwork. Well, this was patently absurd, but doing favors for adults makes children feel very grown up and magnanimous. The good readers liked showing off. Even the more backward ones were willing to mutter and look at the pictures with Rosie at their side. I would sit at the desk, shuffling paper but listening as the children read, and slyly gave help when they needed to sound out a hard word. In my experience, most children, even backward ones, can do well in school. They just need one person who will cheer them on. One person who can say with serene confidence, I know that you can do this. When at last a squiggly jumble of letters began to form words and sentences and paragraphs of meaning, well, it was like witnessing a miracle. When I saw a child make sense at last of written English, I was rewarded with a gap-toothed, face-splitting, ear-to-ear grin. As the depression deepened, parents needed every nickel. Once again, sons and daughters were pulled out of school and sent out to sell newspapers or shine shoes or even, in America, to beg. Sometimes a child would come to the school library one last time to say goodbye to me and Rosie. I would dry tears and open a desk drawer and help them fill out a card request for the public library. And we didn't collude on this. The public library, I'd tell them, is like a giant bookstore where everything is free. No one will ever tell you to stop learning at the library. Rosie and I go there every Saturday morning when it's nice weather. We read stories under the big tree. Come and visit us. So you see, in the end, sorrow born in my middle years spared me much grief in my old age. For with my family all long dead, my whole world was those children. To them, I had always been the nice old lady at the library. And to me, they would be forever young, full of hope and possibility. Looking back over the last 100 years, we know what is coming for those children. We live in Agnes Shanklin's future. We have seen wars, large and small, that have their roots in the Versailles Treaty and the hilariously named 1921 Cairo Peace Conference, when the imperial victors of the Great War drew lines on maps and crushed the hopes of nations and colonies around the world. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, China, Korea, Tibet, Vietnam, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the Philippines, the Congo, the Sudan, Algeria, Egypt, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Mozambique, Angola. There hasn't been another great influenza, but we have known tuberculosis, polio, AIDS, Ebola, and now the Zika virus. We lived through the stagflation of the 1970s and the bursting of the dot-com bubble in the 1990s, and we came frighteningly close to a second Great Depression, brought on by banks that played with money that wasn't their own and didn't seem very serious at the time. Through it all, for 100 years, this library has opened its doors and welcomed anyone who wanted to learn or to be entertained, to prepare for a better future, or to escape from a harsh reality, to read and to think in a quiet refuge from the crazy damn world outside those doors. Faith in the future is required to bring a library into existence and to keep it going year after year. This library, the people who founded it, the people who funded it in the beginning, those who pay their taxes to keep it open and who raise money for the Friends of the Library, and you can buy them. And who come to events like this, they all demonstrate that a library is a worthy repository for hopes and dreams. That is what we honor today. Thank you for being a part of this library's past, and thank you for carrying on a great tradition here in Cleveland Heights.